Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. This is the second episode with Meghan, and this time we speak about all kinds of support modalities that are on offer to treat grief and trauma. This is by far the best episode if you want to get clarity on how grief and trauma works, what you might experience, and to find out what kind of treatment is out there and might be the right way to support yourself personally and maybe professionally. Just listen and sense into what feels or sounds good for you and try it. Also check out episode number 41 to listen to Meghan's personal story. About this week's guest. Meghan Riordan Jarvis is an author, podcast host, TEDx speaker and psychotherapist specialising in trauma, grief and loss. After experiencing PTSD following the death of both of her parents within 2 years of each other, Meghan began speaking on a larger scale about the importance of understanding grief and supporting grievers. Founder of Tacking Point Partners, Meghan and her team consult regularly with companies addressing grief in the workplace. Meghan's Grief is My Side Hustle platform includes her popular podcast of the same name, her blog, and her free grief writing workshop, Griefmates. Meghan's memoir, At the End of the Hour, will publish in December 2023. Please listen to this episode and take out as many good ideas as you can and go check them out. So welcome, Meghan. We have Meghan here again on the podcast, and I'm excited to talk to you about a couple of things that we've sort of started talking about last time when you were on. And actually, for those people who haven't listened to the episode with Meghan where she shares her journey, please go back to episode number 41 and you'll get an insight into Meghan and you get to know her. But we're going to talk about some very interesting things today, and we sort of spoken about it off microphone just before. But first of all, I want to say hello. How are you today?
Oh, it's nice to see you. Thank you so much for having me back.
So Meghan is a therapist, a psychotherapist, and she is really in tune with all the things that people can use, because just as me, she's also focused on grief and trauma. So the two of us, we're going to talk about the different modalities that Meghan knows about and does use with her clients and would recommend. So we're looking at what are the helpful tools to use when someone is grieving. What are the helpful tools if someone is in trauma or is dealing with trauma? And then the combination there, what is someone dealing with traumatic grief? And we're going to go into that a little bit. And as always, you can find certain links in the show notes if you want to go look. And always just Google for someone near you that can help you. So where do we start, Meghan?
Well, let's do a quick review, because I think, you and I talk about grief and loss, and a lot of our colleagues in the grief and loss space want to remind people that, grief is just a developmental process. It's a normal part of life.
Exactly.
And we're wired to grieve, and we have a lot of instincts about grief and loss. And we have data that sort of shows that most people are able to find relief just in their own instinctive processes and what their body drives them to do, and kind of in the natural supports that are around them. So there's the support that we all deserve to have in grief and loss. And a lot of us in the grief field, we talk about that. We talk about how do you talk to people about your experience? When you're feeling isolated and alone, what are good, just sort of healthy grief practices? And there are a number of good books out there that it's a bit like when you're pregnant, you can go and get a book on pregnancy, but even if you didn't read the book, the body would probably figure out how to, help you have this baby. What you and I talk about is more when the things get stuck.
Exactly.
And this is a dicey game because we don't do global core education about grief and loss. It's really hard for people to know, when have I sort of touched over the line into when it would be nice to have support versus I actually need some treatment.
Mm-hmm. And I like the fact that you normalize grief right from the beginning. And I totally agree with you. Grief is something that we are born to go through, to deal with, if it is not complicated. And so similar to when someone has an injury and that injury is going the normal road, then they can deal with it. But if something gets inflamed like a cut, then it's good to have support, and the right kind of support.
That's right. And so, most of the people that have come to see me in my office are coming in not realizing that what they are presenting with is any one of the words or languages. The field is always shifting. I think because we have a formal diagnosis in this country in our diagnostic code, which I'll just remind people, it's not a litmus test. We didn't take some sort of medical strip and put it on your skin and say, oh, you have prolonged grief disorder. A bunch of people got together, they created, a series of qualities and symptoms. And if you have them for a certain period of time, you qualify as having prolonged grief disorder. And I don't mean to be dismissive of those diagnostics, but the diagnostics have to help you decide what sort of treatment to give to a client or to seek as a griever. And so I think it's much more useful, rather than saying, do I have complicated grief? Do I have prolonged grief? Is it profound? Is it traumatic loss? Is to go back to what are the symptoms you are experiencing. That, exactly. I think, is the best sort of bellwether. So I am very inclusive as a treatment provider. There is an argument about the change in the diagnostic. We put prolonged grief disorder in our books so that people would be able to get treatment.
Exactly.
But my argument about that is I never had any trouble giving people treatment or providing them treatment with the coding that already existed in the book. So throwing out those labels and going back to what's going on for you and how long has it been going on. So one thing, and I've been talking about this on my Instagram a lot the past couple of weeks because I always sort of respond to the DMs that I get from people, but I've been talking about ruminations. So ruminations are one of those things that as a clinician, I would tell you I take a really hard look at. They are incredibly common in early grief. You hear that someone that is beloved to you died. It is typical, normal, and adaptive for your mind to then pop into, oh my God, why didn't I go home to see them at Christmas? What if I had, called them earlier? A rumination is that thought on a track. It goes around in a circle. And just to give you the distinguishing, it's also really common to develop worry and panic in grief. Worry is adaptive. I am worried about how I'm going to pay my light bill. When I'm worried about it, I am like, maybe I'll ask my Uncle Dave. Maybe I will. Worry has a resolution. If I worry about this, it's going to produce something. Anxiety actually means that the body, the system that you live inside, has activated an alarm system that's on. And that can be adaptive. Yep. It's right to have some anxiety. People often have anxiety right after a loss. But anxiety is a state of being. Ruminations are a circle inside your head. And ruminations can be images that you see. So for me, I saw my mother's dead hands. I ruminated on them. I couldn't stop seeing them in my head. Sort of relentless. Or thoughts. My thought that I had was, it's my fault that my mother died. And honestly, they jog around like a track, like a high school track, and they don't go anywhere. But their purpose is to distract you. Right?
So
they are a distraction. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So is anxiety after grief and rumination, is it linked? Is one part of the other, or is one producing the other? What is the connection between those two?
I don't know the connection. Like, I can't say the causality. What I can say is, what do we normally see? And so death is the ultimate terrible thing that our bodies are always trying to protect us against.
Mm.
We have a type of vigilance, a way of sort of assessing the information around us to keep ourselves safe. When something traumatic and terrible happens, that elevates. And if that elevates for too long, you will feel yourself in an anxious state. You're edgy, you're worried, it's hard to go to sleep. So anxiety can be this condition that develops, and it may include ruminations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ruminations are usually something that people say, like, just as the sun goes down, and when the sun goes down, our body actually naturally becomes a little more anxious. The sun goes down, I start to have these worries, they become relentless, I can't sleep, and they drive these sort of secondary problems. So I look at ruminations and I say, what are your ruminations? How long have they been going on? Are they getting better or worse? Because your body should stabilize as it gets used to the grief information. Mm-hmm. You just learned that your grandmother died. It's a shock. The first few days, your body is overwhelmed. The image I always use is like when it's a shocking loss, it's like you're trying to drink a gallon of water in a minute. When it's not a shocking loss, it's a little bit more like a gallon of water in cups over certain days. You're still drinking the information, but it's how does it hit the system?
Yeah.
So ruminations to me are one of the key that I look at and say, these look like they're kind of locking in. And I just want to say this, you and I talked about it last time, but I feel like we use the word trauma without necessarily knowing what it means. So a trauma is just an event. It could be anything. You and I could go to a concert and you could come home from the concert and say, that was so great, I loved it. And I could say, I'm never going to a concert again and not sleep for 20 days. Mm. So the event the trauma is not so much what is the event, although there are certainly some events that are just, anybody would say they were traumatic. It's the meaning that your system makes of the event.
Yeah. So what happens inside of you as a response to it?
How does the body feel? And so one of the other things that I ask my clients about is, what is your experience across the spectrum of your life with trauma? And what I'm often looking for is something scary or life-threatening or difficult, a single event that happened before the age of 10, or living inside a system that did not have consistent safety. And sort of to get into it clinically, Kaiser Permanente helped develop, which is an insurance company here, helped develop something called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. You can go online. I don't know that people should run in there and start taking the quiz, but I think originally there were 5, there may be 7 factors now. And they're things like, was there a death in the home? Was someone incarcerated? Did you live in poverty? Was there neglect or abuse of any kind? And really what they came to discover, it started as an obesity study, but what they came to discover is that people who had those experiences in childhood, that there was a strong correlation to negative outcomes in adulthood. Mm-hmm. And we do know that from trauma, that unresolved negative experiences that children experience land inside the body and sort of stay there. So the other thing that I'm looking at when people are talking to me about their grief and their symptoms is there any other grief or unresolved trauma inside the system? Because it's a bit like Play-Doh or a ball of dough. Like that's in there. And the way the brain codes information is it's going to go stack your most recent terrible event right with that old one.
Yeah. And
so what we see are people who are having outsized reactions. Friends and family are like, I don't know why, it was just her neighbor. I don't know why she's so upset. Well, she's so upset because she never had any support when she was 10, when her grandfather, who she loved, died.
Exactly.
And the two experiences are together. So what I mostly do in the beginning is sort of do an assessment and say, hey, is it possible that there's some trauma in here? And then when it's trauma, we treat it. Then we need treatment, right?
Okay. So how would you treat it? That's a good lead into what do we do when we notice, okay, well, there is trauma or there's past trauma and present.
Yeah. So, I can tell you what I do. And I think that one of the exciting things about being a trauma trained therapist is that this field is really like exploding and emerging. And we're able to do more to sort of look at how the brain is healing because we have better scans for those things. But really, I'm always looking at the person who's in front of me. So if they come in and they say it's primarily pictures, there is a treatment which is called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a terrible name.
That's why they've used an abbreviation.
And it's, the neuroscience behind it, the person who trained me said like, yeah, there's neuroscience and it's sort of shamanistic. Like you use the optic nerve. So looking at a light bar, so like a stream of light, or I actually respond better to tappers in my hand. Some practitioners put their hands on you and they hold your hands but essentially what you're doing is you're stimulating. It's called bilateral stimulation. You're stimulating both sides of the brain because the brain has two states. It has the right side of the brain, which is the sympathetic nervous system, is the activation side. And then the left, so that's like the heating system in the house. And then the left side is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the cooling system in the house. And generally, when you have people who have panic, anxiety, ruminations, they have an overactive right side of the brain. Mm-hmm. And the bilateral stimulation, it's almost like if you're in a boat and it's tipping over, you're moving some people to the other side of the boat. Mm-hmm. So how people experience it, and I love EMDR and I had a childhood trauma when I was 9, and then I had EMDR when I was 30. And so something that I could have directed it like a movie. That's how core the images were in my head of this one single event. It's still there and I can still call it up, but it feels like a watercolor painting instead of like permanent marker. So when I did the EMDR, I really could understand like, the memory of it now is over a larger space in my brain. Mm-hmm. There's a similar treatment, which is called brain spotting. So EMDR, it has a protocol. You talk about what you're experiencing as you're experiencing it. Really skilled practitioners can walk you through a lot of distress in the body. And so that distress comes out of your body, that energy comes out while you're allowing your brain to sort of be stimulated in a way that it wasn't when the trauma happened. And the other one is called brain spotting, and brain spotting is very similar to EMDR, but you don't talk. So for people, and there's a use of music, and brain spotting is like you take a pen, and as the practitioner, we bring up the memory, whatever the traumatic image is that's in your head, you begin to tell me about it. And then I ask you to follow this pen or this bar, my finger. We turn some music on, and then I'm really attuned to when I can see your eyes shift. And then we work in that moment. And then we just sort of expand it. And again, I am somebody who really responds to both EMDR and brain spotting, but I've had a whole host of clients where nothing happens. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel bad. It doesn't do much. So I think it's a bit like hypnosis, where it's one tool, but it's not a catch-all.
So for some people who you do EMDR with, and that memory still has the same effect that it had just before EMDR.
Yeah. So there are, if you think about what it is that the stimulation, the bilateral stimulation essentially is not effective. So I can't tell you why, but we do know that trauma memories tend to be almost like orange juice concentrate. They're like a stamp in the brain. And so whatever it needs to loosen it, it may be that the optic nerve is not enough to loosen that particular memory. And I've had some people with EMDR get loosening with one session and some who needed 40 sessions. And there are some practitioners that only do EMDR. So it's not, and then there are other therapists who have lots of tools that they use, and EMDR is one of them, which is how I've always worked.
Yeah. So that would be like for people to understand this is a trial and error. I mean, I would say practically with everything that a person is deciding or contemplating of doing is to see how does your nervous system react with that. It's the same with any restaurant that you go. Some people rave about one and you don't like it. So it's a question of how does your nervous system respond to what is at offer.
Yeah. And I think when you're not in trauma, that sounds fine. Like, well, you're going to need to experiment. When you're in trauma, what's really tricky about it is like certainly the people come into my office, they needed relief 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So it can be really frustrating to have to sort of experiment a little bit. But again, a skilled practitioner may even, I have a series of assessment questions that I can ask, and then I just sort of get a sense of where we might start. And so sensory motor psychotherapy or somatic experiencing, which are sort of two branches of the same idea. So the people who do that work are highly trained. They've trained in this for a long time. I mean, I'm trained. Yeah, you are too. It's expensive. It requires a lot of you. You go through the training yourself, so you embody the work. So I have a lot of respect for it. And essentially at the core of both of those pieces of work is the understanding that trauma generally happens in the freeze state of our instinctive responses. So we go through them progressively. We start with fight. If that doesn't work, we go to flight. If that doesn't work, we freeze. People confuse freeze and collapse. Fight and flight are on the right side of the brain. Freeze and collapse are on the left side of the brain. Freeze is the highest possible energy. You would think it was fight and flight, but it isn't. It's freeze. Freeze is our highest energetic state where we are the most alert and hypervigilant and essentially in the most danger because we are not able to do anything except deer in headlights. Collapse is the lowest version of our energy. And people put them together. They talk about freeze as though it's collapse. Freeze can be, you can have no energy in freeze, but there is this version that is the highest, most intense stillness. Like it takes all the energy you have to stay still. And that is where we believe trauma can get into the body and immediately begin to create meaning. People generally have better outcomes if they're able to run away, if they're able to fight their perpetrators. So the work that we do in both of the sensory motors is in that freeze state when you could not defend yourself. We call it up by using memory, and then we use the body to come to a different state of resolution. It sounds nuts, but the purpose and the belief is you have trapped inside you the energy from the moment of the trauma. And it is very easy for that to re-traumatize you. If you smell a same smell, you're going to go back to that moment. And that's what we mean by triggering. So sensory motor takes you back to that moment, and then it helps you find a different resolution. And so sometimes that's just, I worked with a client who was in a car accident that wasn't able to put their arm out and help their passenger. And so that's the work that we did was, bring up the memory and put their arm out. That's what they really wanted to be able to do. And so then the memory exists, but instead of it being as it was, you have this other energetic sensation of actually doing what you wanted to be able to do or what you believe would have. And sometimes people don't know what would be helpful. And in both of those techniques also, you can offer like, well, maybe an angel could come in and help you. Maybe. So it's using your imagination, which is a part of the brain that usually is not available. It has no energetic, like neural pathways that are being tagged when you're in a really activated state of trauma. So again, by acting, you are fine here. You're grounded in this moment. The trauma is not actually happening. We're going to let the energy of the trauma come back up through your body. We're going to keep you safe. And we're going to add some things that weren't there. And I may have given this example. I can't remember in the first time that we were here, but I did some sensory motor work in treatment, and I was alone at the moment that I learned that my mother died. My practitioner had me imagine that my brother came to me and picked me up. And so even though that didn't happen, it a little bit feels like it's what happened.
Mm.
Because again, most of the trauma that we experience, part of what is so hard about it is that we as an individual could not protect ourselves. And whether that happens as a child or as an adult. And in my experience, I was standing alone getting this news about my mom, and I had to take care of a van full of children. What I wanted was for someone to come and take care of me. So I imagined that happened, but it didn't really happen.
Mm.
And it a little bit feels like it does.
Yeah. And the thing with memory, as I've learned, which I find really important in that, is that the memory in itself is not as fixed as we think it is. It's not like a document that you take up on Word and it's the same document as last time you saved it. No, every time you pick up a memory and there's a conversation about it or you think about it, it then gets stored again as the new, as the memory added with all the thoughts and conversations that you have. So your memory from the original time is not the same as it is now. So that's why in forensics they take the witnesses' first recall of the memory and not later down the track when it has already been mulled over and thought about and discussed.
One thing that's so important too about what you just said about memory is that because our brain is a predictive tool, it's using our past experiences to predict what it believes is going to happen in the future. And so one of the big arguments I make for trauma treatment early is that every single time you remember your distressed state, and that's inside your body, you will actually use that memory to predict distress in the future. It's so important. And that's true with ruminations also, that if one of the ruminations people often have is like, oh my God, my kid is going to die while they're on the school bus. If we don't interrupt that, you can very quickly create true panic and like life avoidance because everything's fine. We're right here. The kid is fine, but I am allowing myself to feel a terror that doesn't exist about the future, and it will become a limiting belief. So I love what you just said about how we use memory with sort of that flexibility. Because I think people think, oh, well, it's just my thoughts. It's not that big a deal. But we actually create so much meaning with our thinking.
And I have this beautiful example, which I've shared multiple times, I think, on my podcast, is where in a support group, I shared my experience of holding my daughter as she passed away. And I described that as the honor that I felt having just given birth to her a couple of days prior. And then one participant, she said to me, isn't that interesting? I always saw that event in my life as a burden and as a disaster. But just because I spoke about the honor, she took that bit and sort of as if she tried it on, and it shifted her experience just a little, the tiniest little bit. I was just thinking when you talked about memory, in NARM, the developmental trauma education, we talk about that which is called futuristic memory. So we then say, okay, well, your developmental trauma is coming into your future because you remember it in your child state, and you make of the future what has already happened in your past.
Which is why there is some data out there that says people who have a regular meditation practice, and meditation is not just the word meditation. Meditation is a brain state activation. It's actually sort of calling up equal parts of your brain and allowing them to be relaxed at the same amount of time. So if you think about that as sort of like, I don't know, stretching your legs, if you need to climb a lot of stairs and you have been exercising those leg muscles, you will have an easier time the next days after doing all that walking. Meditation, when we're talking to grievers and talking to people in general, it's such a healthy practice because it's almost something that inoculates you from doing some of that. It allows you to be in the moment with less distress because you have practiced it. And there is some data out there that says those folks tend to ruminate less when it comes to significant events, and that their brain is able to recover more quickly. So that's a healthy practice that I think, it has a lot of power. The other trauma technique that I use probably the most. So I start with EMDR if people come in and they have a lot of physical symptoms and distress, because it can stabilize trauma, meaning it can calm the central nervous system pretty quickly. Then with sensory motor, a lot of what sensory motor is, or somatic experiencing, is sort of setting the boundaries so that you can stay inside the window of tolerance, right? So I see these as kind of progressive. And then I use internal family systems, IFS, which is Dick Schwartz here. It's a modern, technique, just like the sensory motor is, that he's still alive. All these teams of folks are still alive, and he's still teaching us about it. But it is a little bit, the goal of IFS is to unburden the meaning from inside your body. So the concept of IFS is that we all have a core self, kind of like born tabula rasa, and it's inside there, and it's yearning to live at its highest, most integrated existence. So it sounds quite spiritual, although I think practitioners will shift the language depending on who they're working with, and that we develop these parts of ourselves. And the parts are managers. So the ones who sort of have the clipboard and say, okay, if we do these 10 things today, everything's going to be okay. So they are proactively trying to keep us safe. And then there's the firefighters. And the firefighters are the ones that sort of come crashing in and say, this is too much. You're not okay. We're getting you out of here. And what IFS, and the purpose of that is, there are parts of ourselves that have been exiled in childhood, exiled in trauma, that our whole system is trying to protect. And so if we can recover these little exiles and say, it's okay for you to live a life, and get in harmony with our system. Like, I don't need you to drink too much. That's a firefighter technique that I'm not going to use. I don't need the managers to boss me around and tell me I have to work 12 hours a day. So IFS is a practice that works really well for all kinds of, people who are coming in with anxiety, people who are, coming in with depression. It's a really lithe tool in that way. But the piece that is really wonderful about IFS is when you do an unburdening, you ask the client, there's a lot of imagination and creativity. It's such an exciting technique, how they think they might be able to pull this energy, essentially trauma, outside of their system. And then you release it out into the world by putting it in the water, burying it, burning it, sending it up to the sky. And again, IFS is not a one session, but I have seen people do unburdenings in one session that shift their bodies and the way that they look kind of forever after that.
So if someone listening to this want to know, what is the right kind of approach for me? How would they sort of sense or feel or hear or get an idea of what's the right approach, where to start?
I don't think that is the griever's job to know that. So what I would say is, if it occurs to you just one time, I think maybe I need more help with these symptoms. This grief is maybe more than I know how to do. It doesn't matter whether it's traumatic loss or just your grief. It doesn't matter if a clinician says this is typical grief that will resolve on its own, or thank God you came in, you needed treatment. As a griever, you don't need to know that. Go find someone who is, I say it's sort of easier in the world these days to find someone who is trauma informed, because there are long-standing, very highly clinical, I know, people have been in these trainings for a long time. They've spent a lot of money. They have had to pass exams and certifications. It's easier to find those folks, I think, than someone who you can say there is a standard of care around being truly traumatic grief informed, and they will know how to treat me. So grief is the reaction to loss. Loss doesn't always drive trauma, but if someone is trauma informed, they will know how to handle those things. If someone is just like a grief coach, which I think grief coaching is such an extraordinary service, it's not a treatment. So you're not going to get treatment from a grief coach. So you want to find somebody with some letters after their name, and you want to walk in and say, these are my symptoms. And then it's their job to educate you. Okay, it sounds like this is what's going on, or that's what's going on. And it'll be a hypothesis, and you guys will work together, and they may have other tools that they employ than the 3 that I just described. Those are my 3 favorite, but there are many out there. And some of the ones that are out there right now are things that I don't know a tremendous amount about. There's there's a huge movement around plant medicine and using psychedelics in order to treat trauma. That just isn't something that I am trained in. So if you had a different practitioner in here, they might be raving about all the statistics about that. And I am excited to learn more about that. I don't think it's something that I will ultimately train in. But I absolutely believe that it could be helpful. And so one of the partnerships about being with a clinician who, is trained in multiple things and believes that we are wired to heal is that, you just co-create an experiment together. Let's just see if this helps. Let's just see if this works. I mean, I have been stunned when people come in and say, I'm taking this art class and it's the most powerful. I have somebody who started open water swimming, and it just moved the energy through his body in the way that I think partly because the water is very cold, and the cold is stimulating his vagus nerve. And there are there are lots of ancient treatments for when people are dysregulated. And mostly when clients come in and say, I don't know if you've heard of this. I may not have heard of it, but I'll learn about it with them. And I think the belief that something might be able to help you is a good enough reason, to be curious about it.
Yeah. And so on my podcast, there's already some people who spoke about the things that you mentioned. So for example, episode number 32, it's Estelle Thompson who speaks about how yoga and art saved her life after the loss of her son. And there's others who speak about whatever they have done. And part of my book, Surviving My First Year of Child Loss, people looked at the first year and said, well, what actually helped me? And it's fascinating because there's things that people can do, that everyone can do without needing to go anywhere.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's really, I think it's limitless as to what can shift a person's nervous system. And it's that beginning to be in tune with what speaks to me. And I mean, for example, I use a 30-minute discovery session for people to get a feel for me, and I get a feel for them, whether I'm the right person to help them, because I believe that the client-therapist relationship is the basis upon which anything can be helpful or not. And if that basis isn't right, then there might be a better person to work with that.
Absolutely. And I do think I want to be complimentary of our field, because I think everyone is incredibly well-intended. I think most of us come in with some of our own personal experience, and that's what calls us into the work. I don't think everybody is equally trained, and it's not required that everyone be equally trained. And so I do think you want to be a consumer and ask, exactly. What training in grief and loss do you have? What training in trauma do you have? What modalities do you use? Because I was teaching a class to practitioners a couple of weeks ago, and there were multiple practitioners in this room who were not aware that there are separate parts of the brain that create activation and soothing. And so just universally saying to someone, maybe you should take a bubble bath to relax, that actually can make someone unwell. Yeah. The same way that asking someone to go to a yoga class can make them unwell.
Yeah.
So, and I do actually think there are some books out there that I've read where people say these are the things that will help you, but you can't say that because you need to know which side of distress is your nervous system in. Are you too activated? Are you too anxious and too panicked, or are you underactivated? Because
Yeah.
So, if anyone is saying to you, I have a 5-step model and you can take it online, you could go look at it and see if it made sense to you. But I think there's some real harm that can be done when people are in a state of real distress, and they could become re-traumatized or made less well, which is why I say to folks, listen, in grief and loss, you can get support from your pastoral counselor, from your sister-in-law who's a yoga instructor. You can take art classes, cooking classes, so many things I believe will support you in your grief process of moving through energy. But when you are in trauma, and that trauma is inside the central nervous system, I mean, I know all the things and have all the degrees and treat people with all of these expensive and complicated treatment modalities, and I could not get myself out of trauma by myself. And I knew I wasn't. I mean, I hardly tried because I knew it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
So when it's trauma, you do need to seek treatment.
Good. And I think it's important, that last sentence you just said, because for someone like you and I who are trained similar to the dentist, he needs to go to the dentist if he has to get something done. And I think to summarize that, I think it comes back to the state of the nervous system, and to understand, where am I? Am I hyper-aroused? Am I hyper-aroused? And that maybe needs some help from someone that is trained in helping you understand what is the best that you can do. But I think the 2 words that stick with me is for people to ask a person that they might want to work with is, are you grief informed? Are you trauma informed? And then leading on from that, what are the trainings that you took? And understand a little bit and find out in regards to how you feel about that person. Would you add anything to that?
No, well, I think what I would also say, because I'm so sensitive to like bashing our field. Some of the greatest work I have ever done is with someone who had sexual trauma that I was not trained in. But I got so much training because our bond was so strong. So I do think the therapeutic bond, that sometimes working with a therapist who doesn't have the skill set, but I really trust, that therapist then can help you get, I don't do this now, but I used to do some trauma work when I wasn't trained in EMDR and just send somebody to an EMDR specialist for a few sessions. So, we sort of circle back around, which is when you go and you meet someone that you believe can help you, they may not be trained in EMDR, but they may be the beginning step to the help that you need.
And would you agree with me that basis of having that relationship with someone is being able to be in a safe space? And when you're in a safe space, it's the counter to the trauma where you weren't in a safe space.
Yeah, that's a question that people ask me all the time, which is like, how do you know that you're healing from trauma? How do you know? Like, how would I know if I was? And so I spend a lot of time with my clients saying like, hey, I just want to remind you, you had a similar experience like this 8 months ago. And we had to have an emergency session. And what we're talking about is the energy inside your body is more tolerable. That window of tolerance, that your ability to sit with and be in is greater. It doesn't mean I'm never going to think about this bad, sad thing again. That is not what it means. It means the dysregulation lessens, that you don't have to go to bed for 4 days because your body has integrated it and figured out a way to carry it. The image that I often use is that, you're handed this watermelon in a traumatic loss and you're told to carry it. And it's exhausting and awkward and uncomfortable. But that over time, you figure out how to chop it up, blend it up, integrate it, dry it, so that you're still carrying it, but it's not the same kind of a burden. That's what trauma healing looks like. It's not, right? It's not that we never think about the thing again or we never get upset again. It's that we don't get upset to the degree. It doesn't dysregulate us. It doesn't start to our ruminations. It doesn't tell us that everything is going to not work out okay. And I think that's really important because my traumatic experience qualified as PTSD because I had images and I live with PTSD. It still pops up. I still will have some of those ruminating thoughts, but they, when they started, I couldn't leave my porch and I didn't eat for multiple days on end because my internal system was so dysregulated. I couldn't like put anything inside. When I have those thoughts now, I am inside a sort of space where I can acknowledge them, I can shift them, and then I can soothe my own, internal experience and sort of show up with compassion instead of just panic.
So you've learned to carry the watermelon. I think that's
learned to carry the watermelon.
That's a beautiful metaphor, which is probably a good place to end with. And for those people listening, if you need support, go and check out the links in the show notes and find your way through Google. And if you have any questions, send me an email. And thank you so much, Meghan, for another beautiful conversation that I'm absolutely sure will help those dealing with grief and trauma to find their way. Thank you, Meghan.
You're welcome. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.